It's all about strategy, outmaneuvering the opposition, bending them to your will.
We're unstoppable!
What are you doing in my office, Dex?
Winning.
It's not every day that there's a reboot for one of my favourite childhood gaming franchises. I'm talking about Sega's classic Shinobi series, with both Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3 spending a pretty fair amount of time inside my Mega Drive back in the early 90s. And it's just had a massive update in the form of a brand new entry with Shinobi Art of Vengeance, available for PC, Nintendo Switch, the PlayStation and Xbox. Even bringing back veteran composer Yuzo Koshiro to create some new music for the soundtrack. Developed by Lizard Cube, who previously worked on Streets of Rage 4. Takes things in a similar direction, massively overhauling the visuals and gameplay to make the whole thing feel a lot more modernised. And after having spent about 10 hours with this, cutting my way through every scumbag that dared get in my way, I have to say these guys have done a pretty awesome job here. I gotta be honest, I wasn't really expecting all that much, and I would have just been happy with a simple 2D platformer. But what they've done here instead is turn it into a full-on Metroidvania light, with different combos, abilities, and various ninja powers, along with some humongous levels with intricate secrets and combat encounters. A surprise to be sure, but a welcome one.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
So, let's talk about it, shall we? So what little story there is here is almost all handled during the prologue, bringing back good old Joe Musashi, who's hanging out with his pregnant wife in their picturesque, idyllic village, the home of the legendary Oboro clan, before it's suddenly under attack and Joe has to rush off to defend it. At which point he's more or less the Doomslayer, just a tough, no-nonsense dude who communicates in grunts and goes around ripping and tearing.
My head is spinning.
Soon discovering that this attack is led by the E&E Corporation, led by the evil Lord Ruse, with the entire village wiped out and the inhabitants all turned to stone.
So, the head of the Oboro clan finally shows his face. Well, some of it.
The backstory is that Ruse was supposed to be next in line for the role of becoming the literal Grim Reaper, only instead he decided to rebel. He stole the Grim Reaper's scythe and is now using its power to take over the world, along with building up an army of his own demons. Badass.
How badly do you want to kill me?
So, Joe has to then travel across the country, taking on every ninja, mercenary, robot, and yokai that gets in his way, even teaming up with a few other characters that he meets.
I'm going to wipe out the Oboro clan entirely. Prepare to die.
Daddy, chill.
There's the odd cinematic here and there and some dialogue speckled throughout things, usually before a boss fight or in between each of the main acts. But most of the time it's just you running from one side of the screen to the other, or in some cases up and down as well. Because compared to the previous games where you just mostly went from left to right the entire time, this is a much more dynamic and complex experience, with multiple routes throughout the levels, plenty of secrets to find, and stuff you won't even be able to access until later on in the game. Until you've unlocked certain abilities and items like the Ninja Claw for climbing up certain surfaces, you got the Ninja Rope or a ground slam move that breaks through weakened floors, you know, that kind of stuff. What I think is really handy too is how, like all good Metroidvanias, on the map screen, secret areas are a different colour to everything else, letting you know when you're straying off the main path and helping you locate what you might have missed. And then hopping back into finished levels is super easy as well with this whole checkpoint system, letting you teleport to any area of the map instantly. Along with constantly earning cash from kills and opening chests, you're buying new skills and upgrading your abilities further in the shop, with a merchant character that feels appropriate and I think really understood the assignment.
Hey there, Shinobi. Welcome to the yokai shop. What are you buying?
I don't know, it just makes the whole thing more fun than running in a single direction the entire time, with there often being multiple objectives you need to complete. There's a city level, for instance, which is comprised of about 3 different sections, where you need to navigate each of them one by one to rescue hostages.
I'm so sorry for that. You just look really scary is all.
And then each act is also comprised of 2 or 3 of these kind of stages, which you can play in any order you want. Despite all of that though, Art of Vengeance absolutely takes a lot of influence and cues from Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3. And it really does at times just feel like an updated version of both of those games. The opening level, for instance, takes place in a village, like in both of those old Mega Drive games, because, I don't know, these poor villagers, they just can't catch a break. Then it's even got that same boss-type enemy with the big samurai guy decked out in armor and carrying a giant sword.
Another Oboro, ripe for the culling.
A few moments later.
Shut up, bitch!
You got a level set near a waterfall, there's another one on a train, and then the first bonus stage is pretty much the horse riding level from Shinobi 3. Only this time you're riding on what I think is supposed to be the dog from Shadow Dancer. Later on there's another similar stage where you're surfing, dodging some familiar looking enemies. It's got a very similar sequence where you're falling off a destroyed bridge and then have to jump from falling rock to rock. Again, totally defying the laws of physics. Along with a bit where you're on an elevator and have to both avoid enemies but then also navigate the environment so you don't get squished. All of which is a lot easier than it was in Shinobi 3, by the way. But then there's even smaller references, like during the levels set inside the labs, you got those little sludge things inside those giant tanks that burst out to attack you. The ninjutsu abilities are almost exactly the same as well. And with one of the amulets you get that increases your damage, it uses the symbol from the power-up in the old games. Plus there's even like an air kick move which is the same as the one in Shinobi 3. Now that's not to say that it doesn't have any original ideas though, and there's some really cool looking stuff here and there. One of the best sequences I think by far is one set in this very Neo-Tokyo looking city. Of course, you know, one that's drenched in constant rain, where you're moving through all of these dilapidated apartment buildings with the walls covered in graffiti, constantly getting into fights along the way. At one point during this level, you're scaling up the side of a building, moving past a huge neon Mega Drive sign, only to reach the top where there's another, even bigger, giant Sega sign, which just feels like a bit of a love letter to these iconic games. We'll be honest though, like, I probably would have preferred pixel art instead of these hand-drawn visuals, but either way, like, you can't deny that this is a shockingly good-looking game at times, and some of the environments are just absolutely stunning. Like at the fish markets, for instance, when you're outside on the docks and you can see multiple layers of the background scrolling at once. There's a flock of seagulls off in the distance too, not to be confused with the 80s band of the same name. And then with all the puddles on the ground, you get these brief glimpses of Joe's reflection as you're running around. It just looks amazing. Well, yeah, and speaking of Joe, he's animated really smoothly too, and he looks about as graceful and deadly as you'd expect for a guy who's really made mass murder his whole pastime. The enemy designs are all varied and distinct as well, so you always immediately know what you're coming up against when it spawns in, which is very important in a game like this when there's so much happening at once. I also really like the use of the camera zooming in for cinematic purposes as well, like when you're moving through a vent or something, it often zooms in to make it feel a bit more claustrophobic. But then once you're back outside, it'll zoom out again to make the size of the surroundings seem more epic and grandeur.
Cool. Yeah, it is cool.
Can at times be a bit of an issue though, like if it zooms out too much during combat, it can be really hard to keep track of what's going on, because you're seeing things from such a wide perspective, and at least the option to modify or control that would have been nice. Sadly though, the game lacks that option, in fact it lacks a whole heap of options it probably should have had. I don't want to be crucified, but I do want to say as well that I don't think the music here is all that memorable, you know, at least compared to the old stuff. The couple of tracks by Yuzo Koshiro are easily the best that's in this game, but I mean everything else just sounded a bit generic to me. Just these sort of adequately produced but unexciting tracks and nothing that ever really caught my ear. But then again, considering how good some of Yuzo's old songs were from the 16-bit era, that is a tough act to follow. Compared to Revenge and Shinobi 3 though, where the combat was almost entirely ranged, combat here is almost entirely melee. I mean, you still do have throwable kunai, but the max count here is far less, and even by the end of the game, I only had about 30 or so in total. There are a few fighter enemies that can be killed easily by this thing, but it mostly comes into play during combos. With there being a really cool one there, where you can end a combo by throwing a bunch of these into someone as you leap backwards. just kind of seems to do far less damage to enemies on the whole, and outside of those few enemy types, you're likely going to be focusing on melee primarily, which is fine because this stuff kicks ass. Now the way this works is you've got a light attack and then a heavy attack, with most of their earlier combos just being variations of light attacks followed by a heavy attack. The difference here is that heavy attacks do more damage, but then they also launch enemies into the air, leaving them wide open for air juggles, with there then being a few different options you've got in that regard too. And I'll admit that I'm not all that amazing at the game, but every now and then I was able to pull off some pretty sick combinations. And the fact that it works against certain bosses really opens things up there for some ludicrous damage capabilities, with almost all of these combos having to first be unlocked and then purchased from the shop. Your main method for actually avoiding damage is a dash move, because of course it is, which gives you limited iframes, allowing you to dodge most incoming attacks as long as you time it right, with enemies always telegraphing dodgeable attacks with a giant red outline and then unavoidable attacks with a purple one. You know, the kind of thing you can instantly look at and understand what needs to be done. Simple, clean visual communication. And I don't know if someone at Lizard Cube played Dead Cells or if it's referencing something else, but this whole mechanic really feels identical to me to how the dodging works in that game too. Anyway, you've also got 3 other things to think about. You got your base damage, your armor damage, and then an enemy's execution meter. Now, base damage is pretty obvious. I mean, it's what it sounds like, and the same I think goes for damage to armor as well. Just with the catch there being that some of the enemies have like a second health bar essentially, which then gives them a resistance to your combos. So, knocking the armor off quickly with the right attacks is the way to go. But then certain combos and moves work better against armor, like the cannon punch, not to be confused with the donkey punch, which is what your mum likes. Whereas execution refers to the little white bar underneath an enemy's health, which when filled up, lets you execute them for an instant kill. Yeah, it's that classic ninja trope where you fly into someone and just decimate their entire torso, which reminds me a little bit of the glory kills in Doom Eternal, even giving you back some extra health and more gold coins. You can even chain a bunch of these together at once if you're clever enough, and I'd imagine there's benefits to doing that for certain fights, but most of the time I just got excited and executed people as soon as I could. Not to mention the sound design and the visual effects during all of this with that slowdown to really emphasize the impact of that finishing blow is super satisfying. You can even execute bosses as well, man, for those extra gamer points. And then the final aspect to consider is the Ninpo abilities, which affect all 3 of those other factors a lot quicker. For instance, one of the first ones you get is more or less a flamethrower, which just does basic damage to the enemies. Then after that, you'll get the Thunder Ninpo, which has Joe zipping all over the place and hitting the enemies a bunch of times, quickly charging up their execution meter. Which, yeah, is really handy if you chain it together with a bunch at once. You know, to ideally execute them all at the same time. There's another really useful one there too, where you throw out a bomb, which can usually knock off most of an enemy's armor in a single hit. But the best one by far though is the Water Ninpo, which acts as more or less the parry move in the game, doing super high damage to armor, almost again knocking an entire bar off in one strike, as well as just being a really effective counterattack. And I really wish I realized earlier on just how good this thing is, because again, it's even useful against certain bosses. It's just, I'm not a very smart man, and it wasn't until I was about 4 or 5 hours in where I really noticed how effective it is. Especially when you're overwhelmed and stuck between a rock and a bag of shit. You do still need to time it correctly though, but it basically negates any damage from an incoming attack, even the unavoidable ones, really just giving you a free hit. You do also need to have enough energy stored up to use it in the first place though, same thing with all these other abilities, and it's not until much later in the game you get 2 and then even finally 3 bars. But still man, if you're watching this and planning to play through this game, get this thing equipped and use it as much as you can. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that not all Ninpos are created equal. One of them has you throwing out this giant ninja star thing, which is supposed to be effective against armor, but in reality it seems about as effective as harsh language. One of the most iconic moves in the old games was how you could double jump and then throw out kunai in every direction, something I used to abuse the absolute piss out of. Which does come back here as well. There's one of these equipable Ninpo, but it just feels really unsatisfying. Like they felt they had to include it, but they didn't know how to implement it fully.
That's a damn shame.
And then the final one you collect is the Spirit of the Serpent, which sounds like a rad name for a death metal band, and it has really powerful looking stats, only it takes longer to charge up than a Kamehameha, or to do about as much damage as hitting someone with a soft pillow. There is at least a lot of customization there with those different amulets you find, so I don't know, maybe some of these could be improved in that way, but honestly I've got no idea. I just know I found myself using things like the water Ninpo the most, and I got through the whole game with little drama. It also helps that this is definitely a lot more forgiving than the older games. I mean, for starters, there's no life system, so when you run out of health, you just spawn back at the nearest checkpoint as many times as you want. And then every time you reach a checkpoint, it instantly refills all of your health points. Even if you fail the platforming, like you fall off a ledge or something, it only takes away a small chunk of your health and then, again, respawns you nearby. You know, compared to the old games where once you ran out of lives and continues, that was it. Game over, bitch. I should also mention as well, this is on the default difficulty mode called Shinobi, with there also being Apprentice, Novice, and then Custom, where you can really crank up all those stats like enemy damage to the max. I don't know if I was doing something wrong here either, but I also found that the ninjutsu moves weren't all that useful either. Again, like given how long it takes to charge them up to begin with, and then how little damage they seem to do. So most of these are again returning from Shinobi 3 with the Fire Dragon for instance, which arguably looked better in the old games than it does here. You got the shield as well, though this time it instead reduces the damage you take as opposed to stopping it. Along with that explosion one returning as well, where Joe yeets himself at the cost of using up almost his entire health bar, instead of using one of his available lives. But it was the new one that I found myself using the most, which is the healing ability, where some bodacious looking goddess babe appears out of nowhere and restores almost all of your health.
Let me see that again. I didn't get a good look at that.
Yeah, speaking of the boss fights, I thought these were okay for the most part. Usually coming at the end of each stage, where you've got to then take on some super tough enemy in a closed off arena. And I either seem to beat these on my first or second attempt, or instead get stuck on them for like 20 minutes. But either way, you can always see where you're failing and know what you're doing wrong here. What is a bit of an issue for me though, is how the bosses have a warning indicator for where their massive attacks are going to go, which is good, only that marker is red and I'm red-green colorblind. And in combination with some of the backgrounds, I could often barely spot this. And since there's no accessibility settings for colorblind idiots like me, this made certain boss fights needlessly tricky. Yeah, damn cursed genes. I do find it kind of lazy as well, how some of the bosses are more or less just inanimate objects, like a statue or something that stays in one place the entire time. Like one of the early ones, for instance, is against Mandara, who's a returning boss from the first Shinobi game, by the way. And this thing just hangs out on the right side of the screen the entire time, pummeling the shit out of you. And although you do have to move around the area to avoid its attacks, you spend most of the fight just mashing combos into its stationary head. Like I'm getting into a fight with a fucking dining table. And I don't know, like it just feels far less exciting than when you got a bunch of things flashing around on the screen at once and you really have to utilize your entire skill set. The other thing is that they kind of recycle a few of the bosses as well, just repeating them again later on in slightly different forms as if we wouldn't notice. But I would say that overall, I found this stuff to be acceptable and suitably challenging. Just around the time I was about to throw my controller out the window, something would finally click and I'd managed to finally get through it. And I think the only fight that is genuinely challenging is the final encounter against Ruse, only because you have to fight through 2 different phases without any checkpoints in between. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, that's what the whole thing's supposed to be about, right?
Yes, master. Right here.
And I'm sure that people are going to be putting up videos on YouTube figuring out ridiculous combos where they beat all of these bosses in 0.2 seconds anyway. Make me look like a common pond scum. Now, the final thing we need to talk about is the platforming. And on a positive note, the controls here feel smooth and responsive. Plus, I like how the timing for that double jump is a lot more lenient now. I mean, I swear getting the timing down for the double jump in the old games was almost a skill set of its own. There's a return of wall jumping here as well, which is also a lot less finicky. Plus, there's a bit more depth in there with the dash move and the tools like the ninja claw and the hook. So you got a pretty robust little tool set there when it comes to getting around. Something which becomes second nature really quickly. The thing that does my head in though are these incredibly boring sections where you gotta push around giant fuel canisters or batteries to destroy walls or power something up. Where you pretty much just hold down the directional button while Joe lugs these things along, none of which is exciting or even all that challenging in the slightest. And it's not a one-off thing either, because they bring this idea back like 2 or 3 times in a later level, and then again even after that near the end. There's a few instances where it's required to progress.
Power up.
But where I really kind of found myself losing interest is during these segments where you're leaping up walls and double jumping around with the combat taking a firm back seat. And I really feel like they went a little bit overboard with these sections. I mean, there's a few times when you're being chased by something or running to avoid the screen scroll, like if there's a fire or a building collapsing, or could be a chopper coming after you launching missiles, you know, stuff like that. And these are at least pretty exciting, requiring reflexes to get through them, because if you fail, you can actually die here. And I'd have honestly been happy if these made up the bulk of the platforming in the entire game. But instead, it doesn't, and instead, you're constantly having to switch gears and spend time jumping across platforms suspended above, you know, bottomless pits. Platforming which also seems out of place at times, often involving these weirdly elaborate sequences of traps and other hazards, like jets of fire or acid and lava. Well, how about this shit here, man, with the spinning blades like it's Super Meat Boy? The third level in the game is a very familiar looking factory setting, and this one just goes on and on, much longer than any of the previous levels, and large chunks of it are just devoid of any enemies. And all kind of reminds me a lot of the criticisms that Doom Eternal got for similar reasons. Hey, you'd have all of these really fun and challenging combat encounters, but then the game would just completely change things up and have you jumping and dashing across ravines for 10 minutes, as if they thought that was the only possible way to avoid fatigue from all the combat. And again, here in Shinobi, it's the same thing. You know, creating a bit of a whiplash effect where it really is just going from one extreme to the other. You're either in these incredibly intense and chaotic fights against a bunch of enemies, or you're moving around a mostly empty environment jumping around on shipping containers. Again too, with there not really being any threat of failure, because even if you fall off the ledges, you get little more than a slap on the wrist.
Oh no! Anyway, last week...
I think the most annoying sections by far are after you've picked up this glider, which lets you float slowly, but then also propels you upwards when you're on jets of air. And this is used a whole heap of instances where you're just moving upwards through these thin passageways, where almost every surface is covered in spikes that instantly kill you. If you fail this at any time, it's right back to the beginning of the entire segment. And it's not that it's frustrating to die, it's frustrating because it's the 10th time you've had to do this kind of sequence. Really making it feel like it's a bit of a way they've just tried to pad the levels out, where all you're really doing is moving left and right to avoid getting spiked to death. Reminds me of that level in the old Ninja Turtles game on the NES when you were swimming around trying to avoid all the jellyfish. And look, I know this sounds kind of dumb, and I'm not trying to complain about a platforming game having platforming. Plus, I do realize that the original games had a lot of this stuff too. But look, dog, it was never anywhere near as much as it is here. And all it does is just detract from the awesome combat, which is where the most fun is had here. I mean, I want to get back to killing things, damn it.
To the Oberon.
The good news though is that once you've beaten it for the first time, you never need to do it again. able to bypass all of that and then just collect all the stuff they've hidden throughout the levels. Most of this stuff involves finding hidden chests and secret areas, but then also taking on elite groups of enemies, where you're locked into a room and have to fight a few waves of bad guys that then spawn in. And yeah, like I hate to pull out the Doom Eternal comparison yet again, but I can't help but think of the Slayer gates in that game and compare it to how it all feels here. I don't know, maybe I really just need to go replay Doom Eternal.
Do it.
I do find that the difficulty for these usually comes from the arena itself as opposed to the enemies, simply because the game loves putting you in these really hazardous environments where you're near a floor of spikes or above a pool of acid or something. Though, you know what, in the game's defense, you can also use that to your advantage. And yeah, I don't know, also maybe just skill issue. The other thing to look out for is all of these little rift things opened up by the Grim Reaper, which then features some of the most sadistic fucking jumping challenges I've ever seen. Like it's someone's custom levels in Mario Maker or something that they've made to mess with their sibling. Or again, I don't know, skill issue?
You suck!
I did manage to get through about half of these, but honestly, I think I'd have more fun trying to pick up cactus spikes off sandpaper with my balls. But I will say that the music during these is one of the best tracks in the game, which, you know what, almost makes up for it. Almost. Still though, I think Shinobi Art of Vengeance is a pretty damn easy recommendation, man, and I just appreciate how simple it is in its approach. Just a really fun game, letting you play as one of gaming's all-time best badasses, and go around these gorgeous looking environments cutting people to ribbons. What's not to like? And finally, I can be vindicated with a happy ending in this thing after having never been able to get it on my own back when I played Revenge of Shinobi on my Mega Drive. Yeah, don't even go there. Speaking of which, I think if 7-year-old me had actually played this back in the 90s, well, my head would have exploded over how awesome the whole thing is. So, to Sega and Lizard Cube, if you guys want to keep going back and rebooting all my other favourite Mega Drive games like Golden Axe and Altered Beast and do it properly this time, well, then that's A-okay with me.
Cool. Yeah, it is cool.